Okay, in this video we review percentages, so please take out your worksheets on percentages review, and this is our first rule here. So what is a percentage? Now a percentage is a special fraction where the denominator is 100. Percent means out of 100 or per 100. Now you have heard the word cent because we know that there's 100 cents in a dollar, so when you think of percentage it's per 100. Note that, for example, one whole of anything, for example, a whole pizza, you would say, right, I've got 100% of the pizza. So, or one whole of anything else is 100%. So remember, percent means per 100 or out of 100. So we can say 100% is 100 out of 100. Now we know that 100 divided by 100 is 1. So in our examples, what does 47% mean? 47% means that we've got 47 out of 100. Okay, now here's a little worded problem. If 65% of Year 8 students study a language, what percentage do not study a language? Remember, if we've always got to think of the whole amount. So if all of Year 8 is considered 100%, and if only 65% of Year 8 study a language, then what's left over from the 100%? That would be the percentage that do not study a language. So if 65% study a language, then 100% minus 65%, which is 35%. So 35% do not study a language. So what you can do on your calculator here is just go 100 minus 65, and I've got 35% left over. Okay, if you can pause the video and do this column here that says your turn, and then just start the video back when you're ready. Okay, and hopefully you've had an attempt at that. So 23%, remember percent means out of 100 or per 100, so 23% means 23 out of 100. And also in this worded example here, if 80% of a class have brown eyes, what percentage do not have brown eyes? So remember, the whole class would be 100%, 80% have brown eyes. How much of the class is left over? Well, that would be 100% minus 80%. So 20% would, the answer to that is 20% would not have brown eyes. Okay, we're going to now look at the second bit here on your worksheet, which is converting percentages to fractions. Okay, now remember, percentage means out of 100. So to change a percentage to a fraction, you just write whatever number you've got and then put it over 100. Now we should always, if you're changing a percentage to a fraction, and if you end up with your fraction and it can be simplified, then you need to do that. And I'll show you how to do that in a minute. And then you'll also see that some of these questions here have percentages that are greater than 100%. Now remember, 100% is one whole. So this question here of 192% would be more than one whole, but it's not quite two wholes. So we'll look at strategies to do those two questions in a minute. So let's change these percentages to fractions. Okay, or whole numbers if they are. So 37%, what does percent mean? It means per 100. So that means 37 divided by 100. Now, we cannot simplify 37 over 100. So that one can't be simplified. The reason is we cannot think of a number that goes into 37 and 100. So we leave that one like that. Now looking at the second one, 64% is 64. Out of 100. Now if you look at 64 and 100, we can simplify that fraction. Okay, so we've written that percentage as a fraction, but it can be simplified. Now you might find it difficult to work out which number you can divide both of those numbers by. You might just start off by saying, look, they're both even. 64 and 100 are both even, so I can divide them both by 2. So I'm going to go 64 divided by 2 is 32, and 100 divided by 2 is 50. But then I can look at those numbers again and I can say, look, they're both even as well. So I can actually divide those two numbers by 2 as well. So I'm going to go 32 divided by 2 is 16, and 50 divided by 2 is 25. Now, I can't really think of any number that you can divide 16 and 25 by. So 25's only really got factors of 5 and 5, like 5, and definitely 5 does not go into 16. So 16 over 25 would be the simplest form. Now, notice we divided by 2 and divided by 2 again. Some of you may have realised that, yes, you can just divide both those numbers by 4, and you could have just divided 64 by 4 and you would have got 16, and you could have divided 100 by 4 and got 25 and done that in one step. But it's fine to take 2 steps or 3 steps or how many ever steps you need to take. Now with this next problem, I'm actually going to break this 192% up into 2 parts. That really is 100% plus 92%. Now we know that 100% is 1 whole and 92% is 92 over 100. So my fraction is 1 plus 92 over 100. Now, I want to simplify my 92 over 100 and I want to see if I can divide 92 and 100 by something. So look, we could, remember 92 is almost 100, so I think you can divide 92 by 4. So I'm going to do that. 92 divided by 4 is 23 and 100 divided by 4 is 25. So my answer is 1 plus 23 over 25, or just 1 and 23 over 25. Okay, now you could have also done that question by just writing, I might just do that over here in red, but I'm not sure where I'm going to fit it. So I could have also done this question by writing, well, it's 192 over 100, and then I could have said, well, that's really 1 and 92 over 100, changing the improper fraction to a mixed numeral, and then I would have had to have simplified the 92 over 100 bit anyway as well. Okay, now let's look at 300%. That really is, if you want to look at it, it's 100% plus 100% plus 100%, which is 1 plus 1 plus 1, which is 3. Or we could say, well, it's 300%, which is 300 over 100, which is 3. The other way of doing it is to say, well, 300% is 100% plus 100% plus another 100%, which is 1 plus 1 plus 1, which is 3. So that is another way you could have done that question. Okay, girls, if you can pause the video and attempt these 4 questions in this second column, please, where it says your turn. You can then turn the video back on to check your answers when you're done. Okay, let's look at these answers now. 63% means 63 out of 100. Okay, and that one can't be simplified because there's no number that will go into 63 as well as 100. Now 55% is 55 over 100. Now you have to think of a number that you can divide both 55 and 100 by. Now if you think of your 5 times tables, and if you count with me, we go 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, etc. You'll notice that 5 times tables end in a 5, then they end in a 0, they end in a 5 and a 0. So if you see 2 numbers and one of them ends in a 5 and a 0 and the other one ends in a 0, you can actually divide both those numbers by 5. So I'm going to divide 55 by 5 and 100 by 5. So 55 divided by 5 is 11 and 100 divided by 5 is 20, and that has been simplified. Okay. Now, looking at this next one, 146%. Well, that's bigger than 100%. So that's 100% plus 46%, which happens to be 1 plus 46 over 100, because the 46% means 46 out of 100. Now, I'm going to see if we can divide both those numbers by something, and I think they're both even. We can divide them both by 2. So that's 1 plus, dividing those 2 numbers by 2, 1 plus 23 over 50, which can be just written as 1 and 23 over 50. Now 23 over 50 cannot be simplified. Okay, and now looking at this last question here, 200% is 200 over 100, which happens to be 2 if you do 200 divided by 100, or you can think of 200% as 100% plus 100%, which is 1 plus 1, which is 2, and that gives us the same answer as well. Okay, girls, we're now going to move to the last section of this first page. And here we are converting fractions to percentages. Now you're going to learn a few methods here. What we're going to do, when you've got fractions that are over 10, or fractions maybe over 20, or fractions over 50, for example, and even common fractions like 3/4 and a half, it's fairly easy to change those fractions to percentages, because you've got to remember that percentage means out of 100. So we can easily change this 7/10 to a fraction that is over 100 by using equivalent fractions. So to change a simple fraction like this, like 7/10, to a percentage, we're going to express the fraction as a fraction with a denominator of 100. And then we're going to convert it to a percentage. So 7/10, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to say, well, that is equal to 7/10, and I'm going to times the numerator and the denominator both by 10. Because if I times the denominator by 10, I get 100. And if I times the numerator by 10, I get 70. So 70/100 is 70%. So therefore, I've converted that first fraction to a percentage. Now let's look at this second fraction, 7/20. Now, to convert it to a percentage, remember percentages are really special fractions that are out of 100. Can I make 20 easily into 100? Well, I can by timesing it by 5. Now, to keep this fraction equivalent or equal value, or not change its value, if you times the bottom of the fraction by 5, you need to times the top of the fraction by 5. So we're timesing the numerator and the denominator both by 5. And that will give me a denominator of 100. So 20 times 5 is 100, and 7 times 5 is 35. So I've got that 7/20 is really the same as 35/100. Now, 35/100 is really 35%, because out of 100 or over 100 means percent. Now looking at this third fraction here, 23 out of 50. Now, can we change that 50 into 100? Yes, we can. We can double it, or we can times it by 2. So 50 times 2 is 100. So I have to times the numerator also by 2. So I get 50 times 2 is 100, and 23 times 2 is 46. So therefore 23 out of 50 is the same as 46 out of 100, which happens to be 46%. Now, looking at this last question down here, 2 3/4. Now 2 3/4 is 2 wholes plus 3/4. Now, we know that 2 wholes, if we look back up here, for example, 200% means 100% plus 100%, which is 1 plus 1, which is 2. So 2 wholes is 100%, is really 1 plus 1, which is 100% plus 100%. So 2 wholes is 200%. Now, there are some common percentages and fractions that you should know, and 3/4 is one of them. Now, if you've got a whole circle, it's 100%. If you've got half a circle, it's 50%. And if you've got a quarter of a circle, it's 25%. So a whole circle is 100%, half a circle would be 50%, and a quarter of a circle would be 25%. So therefore, if we've got 3/4 of the circle, we've got 25, 25, and 25, which is 75%. So changing 2 3/4 into a percentage, the 2 represents 200% and the 3/4 represents 75%. So you've got 275%. Now, there is another way that you can change any fraction to a percentage. And this other way is not using this method here, but the other way is to actually just multiply the fraction by 100%, or multiply it by 100. Now, I'm going to quickly show you this method here, but if you do have simple fractions like the ones that I've given you there, you do not need to use that method. But I will just show you in red this method. So for example, with this first one, you would do 7/10 and you would times it by 100% over 1. Now, We're actually going to do more of this when we do this topic later, but if you have a calculator, you would just go 7 over 10 times 100 and your answer would be 70, and then we just write the percent symbol, okay? Same with the second one. If you were to change that fraction to a percentage, you'd write 7 over 20 times 100% over 1, and you would go 7 divided by 20 times 100, and your answer would be 35%, okay? Also for the third one, to change that fraction to a percent, you would multiply it by 100% over 1, and you would go 23 divided by 50 times 100, and you would get 46%. And to do this last question on your calculator, you would go 2 3/4 times 100, and on your calculator you would get 275%. So girls, please pause the video. I want you to attempt these 4 questions here and restart the video when you're done to check your answers. Okay, I just had to pause the video there, so hopefully there's not a jump in the video. Okay, we're going to change the following to percentages. Now the denominator of this fraction is 10, so we can easily convert the denominator to 100 by timesing it by 10. So if we multiply the denominator by 10, we have to multiply the numerator by 10. So denominator becomes 100 and the numerator becomes 3 times 10, which is 30. So our answer is 30%. Now our second fraction, 16 over 20, we can convert 20 into 100 easily by timesing it by 5. So we also need to multiply the numerator 16 by 5 as well. So 20 times 5 is 100 and 16 times 5 is 80. And so therefore 16 out of 20 is 80%. Now looking at the third example, 11 over 50. Now that can be converted, the 50 can be made into 100 quite easily by multiplying it by 2. So if we multiply the denominator by 2, we also have to multiply the numerator of the fraction by 2. So 50 times 2 is 100, and 11 times 2 is 22, so we get 22%. Okay, and the last question here, we've got 3.5. Now that really is 3 plus a half. Now 3 wholes is 300% because every one whole is 100%. So we've got 300%. Now because one whole is 100%, a half would be 50%. So 3.5 would be 300% plus 50%, which is 350%. Okay. Now you could have also done any of those by multiplying your fractions by 100%. Okay, but if you do not have a calculator that you can use, this really is the best method to use. Okay, we're going to go to the second page now. Okay, now here we have to convert percentages to decimals. Now, remembering that the special definition of what a percentage is, a percentage really is a special fraction out of 100. So 27% means 27 over 100. Now, we have to write 27 over 100 as a decimal. So really we've got 27 hundredths. So if we're going to write it as a decimal, our 27 has to end in the hundredths column. So we write our 27 and we've got tenths, hundredths column, and that's correct. So we put the decimal point there before the 2. The other way you can look at it is that you can say, well, 100 has 2 zeros. So I write my number 27. And I have to have 2 digits or 2 numbers after the decimal point, so I would put the point before the 2. And you can also see, well, I've got 27 hundredths because I've got tenths, hundredths. Okay. Now 5% means 5 out of 100. So what I've really got here is 5 in the hundredths column. So I've got 0, that's my units column. I've got nothing in the tenths, and I've got 5 hundredths. The other way you can do this is write the number 5, and because we have to make sure that 5 is in the hundredths column, you've got hundredths column, tenths column, your decimal point, and there's 0 units. Or you can say there are 2 zeros in 100, so I need 2 digits after the decimal point. So I would write 5 as 05, so it's 0.05. Now the next one, 375%. Now that means 375 over 100. I can look at that a few ways. Now to divide a number by 100, At the moment, 375 has the decimal point at the end. If you divide it by 100, to divide by 100, you jump back 1 and you jump back 2 places. So you would get 3.75. Okay? You could have actually done the same with any of these. 27 divided by 100 really means, well, I've got the whole number 27. To divide by 100, I move my decimal point back 2 places. And same with 5 divided by 100. I could write the number 5 and divide by 100, I bring my decimal place back 1, 2 places, and I put my point there. Okay? The other thing you could have done with this question, 375 over 100, sorry, I've just had to cut the video again, so there might be a little jump in it. So look, we'll just leave it as doing 375 divided by 100, dividing it by 100. In the whole number, the decimal point's on the end. So if you divide it by 100, you jump back 1, 2 places, so you'll end up with 3.75. Also remembering that 375 is more than 3 wholes, but less than 4 wholes. So it would be 3 point something as your answer. Now, looking at our last question here, 7.5%. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to write 7.5 as 7.5 over 100. So the 7.5 is a 7.5 and percent means over 100. Now, I need to divide that, to change that to a decimal, I need to divide it by 100. So at the moment, my decimal point is between the 7 and the 5. To divide by 100, I jump back 1 and 2 places and put my point there. So therefore my answer is 0.075. So that's my answer. Okay, you can pause the video and try that last column there that says your turn. Okay, now to change these to decimals. First, change the percentage into a fraction. Now 35% means 35 over 100. And you can say, well, I've either got 35 hundredths, or we can say, right, we've got 35, and to divide it by 100, I move my decimal point back 2 places to have 0.35. With the next question, we've got 3% means 3 over 100, and that means we've got 3 in the hundredths place. Or we can say we've got the number 3, the decimal point's on the end, I'm dividing it by 100, so I go back 1 and 2 places and put my point there. Now in the next question, I've got 152%, which means 152 over 100. Now at the moment, the decimal for 152, it's a whole number, and the decimal point's on the end. If you want to divide it by 100, you go back 1, 2. So your answer is 1.52. Now with this last question, 4.25%. 4 1/4 really is 4.25, so a quarter is 0.25, and so 4 1/4 is 4.25%, means divide by 100. So to do that, at the moment the decimal point is between the 4 and the 2, and you have to divide it by 100, so you jump back 1, 2 places and put your new point there. So your answer will be 0.0425. Now for the next section, which is converting terminating decimals to percentages. Now terminating decimals are decimals that do not go on forever and ever. We've got 0.74, and so the decimal stops or terminates, okay? Now there are 2 methods here for converting terminating decimals to percentages. To actually convert anything to a percentage, you can actually just multiply it by 100%. So I could just go through and multiply all these by 100, and that would give me the answer as a percentage. Or the other method is to convert the decimal to a fraction and then write the equivalent fraction out of 100 and then write it as a percentage. Now I'm going to do both these methods for you. So if we look at the first one, 0.74, I'm going to use the second method here. 0.74 means that I've got 74, and my decimal goes to the tenths and hundredths column, so I've got 74 hundredths, okay? So that means if I wanted to write that as a percentage, that's really 74%, okay? Now, the other way of doing it, actually I'll do it in a minute. This next one here is 0.8, and the 8 is in the tenths column, so that really means I've got 8 tenths. Now I can change 8 tenths into a fraction out of 100 by multiplying both the numerator and the denominator by 10. So 8/10 really is 80 over 100, which is 80%. Okay, now that's the second method here, which is to change the decimal to a fraction, write the equivalent fraction out of 100, which is writing it out of 100, and then writing it as a percentage. The first method here, which can be used to actually change decimals or fractions to percentages, is just to multiply this number here by 100%. So I've got 0.74 and I just times it by 100%. But what I do, I don't put the percentage into my calculator, or I don't use it in my calculation. I just go 0.74 times 100. Now the decimal point is before the 7. So if you want to do 0.74 times 100, you just move the decimal point 2 places to the right and you get 74%. Same with the next question, 0.8. To convert it to a percentage, you times it by 100%. Okay, so we get 0.8 times 100. At the moment, the point is just before the 8. Okay, so if I move it 2 places, because I'm timesing by 100, I go 1, 2, and I end up with 80 point, or just 80, which is a whole number, and I end up with 80%. Okay, so that's another way of doing it. Now we're actually going to use that second method I've shown you for these 2 last questions. So 3.25, if you want to convert that to a percentage, you times it by 100. Now 3.25 times 100, move the decimal point 2 places to the right, and you get 325. Okay, now I've already started this last one. So to do 0.0775 times 100, to convert it to a percentage, you times it by 100. At the moment, the decimal point is there before that 0. So if you're timesing by 100, you move that decimal point 2 places to the right. So we go once, twice. And so our decimal point will end up between the 2 7s. So I end up with 7.75%. And I'll just show it here. I'm moving it once, twice. And up here I moved it once, twice, and I ended up with my decimal point after the 5, which gave me 325%. Okay, now you can pause the video and try this second column here on your own. Okay, to change these to percentages, what we can do, we can write them as fractions first if you want, or you can multiply them by 100%. I'm going to write it as a fraction. So 0.3 is 3 in the tenths column. I can change that to a fraction out of 100 by timesing both the denominator and the numerator by 10, and I get 30 over 100, which is 30%. Now remember, the other method is just to go 0.3 times 100%. Just be careful here. The point is in front of the 3. So timesing it by 100, you jump forward 2 places. So you go times 10 times 100. So we end up with 30%. Okay? With the next question, 0.08, really we've got nothing in the tenths column, we've got 8 in the hundredths column. So that's 8 hundredths, which just happens to be 8%. Again, if you want to use that second method, you've got 0.08. If you want to convert to a percentage, you just times it by 100. And your decimal point at the moment is in between these 2 zeros. So if you times by 100, you're moving the decimal place 2 places to the right. So we go 1, 2, and we end up with 8%. Okay? Now, with these last 2, I think it's just easier to multiply these by 100%. So you actually don't put the percent into your calculator, you're just really timesing by 100, but you actually don't even need to use a calculator, because when you times by 100, you're just making it 100 times bigger, so you're moving the decimal point 2 places to the right, and you'll get 176.5%. And with the last question, 0.095 times, you'll times that by 100 as well. And again, moving the decimal point 2 places to the right, we go it'll end up between the 9 and the 5, and you'll end up with 9.5%. Okay, so I'll just show how it jumps 1 place, 2 places. Okay, all right, now for the last section. Okay, now it really is a good idea, and it's really important actually, to know common percentages. All right, so you really have to know how to convert between common percentages, fractions, and decimals. Now, if we look at these common percentages, 25, 50, 75, 100%, that's where you're really just dividing a circle up into 4 pieces. Okay? So we've got 25%, 50% now, 75%, 100%. Now 25% really is just 25 over 100 or a quarter. Okay? Now as a decimal, remember 25% means 25 over 100, which is 0.25. Okay? Now, might just actually do the decimal bit first. 50% means 50 over 100, or it's 0.5. Girls, remember that 25% and 50%, all of these are not wholes. 100% is a whole. And one whole is the number 1. So all of these answers as a decimal have to be less than 1. Okay, so 50% is half. So what's halfway to 1? It's 0.5. Okay, now 20%. 20% really means 20 out of 100. Okay, or if we can look over here, if it is 20 over 100, it really means 20 over 100. If you divide 20 by 100, you would get 0.2. Okay. 40% is really 40 over 100. And if you divide 40 by 100, you would get 0.4. Okay? What I might do is actually draw a number line here as well. If you've got 0 and then you've got 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, and 1 whole. Okay? So we've got 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, and 1 whole. Or you could say I've got 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, 0.8, 1. Okay? Or we're dividing 0 and 1 into 5 parts. So I've got 1/5, 2/5, 3/5, 4/5, 5/5. Now, sorry girls, sorry, I forgot to write the fraction for 50%, and it's a half. Now, 20%. If I count on my fingers, just watching me, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 20%, right, is 1 finger out of my 5, okay? 40% is 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. 40% is 2 fingers out of my 5, okay? So I'm going to do that with these. 20% is 1 out of 5, because if you count up by 20s and go 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, it's 1 count out of 5 to get to 100. 40%, we go 20, 40, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. It's 2 counts out of 5. Okay? Same with 25%, for example. 25, counting up by 25s, 25, 50, 75, 100. I'm only using 4 fingers there, but 25 is my first count out of 4 counts altogether. Okay? So 33%, these are really common percentages, and this is where I'm actually dividing a circle up into 3 parts. Okay? So if I do 100 divided by 3, I will get exactly 33 and 1/3. So 33 and 1/3% is 1/3. Or it's known as the decimal 0.3 recurring, or 0.333, and it just keeps going on. Okay? All right, now 12.5% is, if you compare it to 25%, it's really half of the quarter. So 12.5 is half of 25. So if I have 25% and I halve it, and I halve all of that, I'm really actually dividing the circle up into 8 bits. So 12.5% really is the common fraction of 1/8. Now, if we do 12.5%, it's really 12.5 over 100. And if you write that as a decimal, it's 0.125. Okay, same thing here. 37.5% really is 37.5 over 100. And if we divide that by 100, we get 0.375. Okay, now sometimes these ones here are a little bit harder to remember. but they're actually where you divide the circle up into eighths. So 12.5% is 1/8, so 25% would be 2/8. If you add 12.5 onto 25, you get 37.5%, so that would be 3/8, okay? Look, sometimes these are a bit hard to remember, but you definitely need to know where you're breaking up circles into quarters. You need to know how to break up circles into 5 parts and to break up circles into thirds. Okay, I want you to try these common percentages and fractions and decimals on your own. Just pause the video and try that. Okay, now hopefully you recognize 75% as 3/4 because we've got 25 and 50, 75, 100. So it's 3 parts out of 4. Now 75% means 75 over 100, which is 0.75. Now 100% really is 100 over 100, which is just 1. And written as a decimal, it's also the whole number 1. Now 60%, that's counting up by 20s. We go 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. 60% is your third count out of 5 counts, okay? And 80% is also counting up by 20s, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. It's your fourth count, or fourth finger, out of 5 fingers. Now 60% means 60 over 100. And if you divide 60 by 100, you get 0.6. 80% is also 80 out of 100. And if you divide 80 out of 100, you end up with 0.8, okay? And we know that 33 and 1/3% is a third. Now, if you do 33 and 1/3% and another 33 and 1/3%, you'll actually end up with 66 and 2/3%. So that means you've got 2/3. Now, the special decimal for 2/3 is 0.6 recurring, meaning it's 0.66666, and that goes on forever, okay? Now, these last two percentages, which are a little bit difficult, if I actually look back over here, we've got 12.5%. If we add another 12.5 to that, you get 25%. Add 12.5 to that, you get 37.5%. Add 12.5 to that, and you get 50%. Add another 12.5, you get 62.5. Add another 12.5, you get 75%. Add another 12.5, you get 87.5%. And add another 12.5, you get 100%. So really what we're doing, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So you're dividing the circle up into eighths. So 12.5 is 1, 12.5% is 1/8. 25% would be 2/8, which simplifies to 1/4. 37.5% is 3/8. 50% is 4/8 or a half. 62.5% would be 5/8. 75% is 6/8 or 3/4. 87.5% is 7/8, and that's done. 100% would be 8/8 or the whole number 1. Now 62.5% really is 62.5 divided by 100. I'll just write it here. It's 62.5 over 100. If you divide that by 100, you end up with 0.625. And 87.5% is 87.5 over 100. And if you divide that by 100, you end up with 0.875. Okay? I'll also just do some of these over here. 75% means 75 over 100. 75 divided by 100 is decimal points here. And when you divide by 100, you move it back 2 places. 60% is 60 over 100. Decimal point for 60 is there. Dividing by 100, the decimal point ends up in front of the 6. Again, 80% is 80 divided by 100. If you divide 80 by 100, you will end up with 0.8. Okay? And I think you just need to learn that one off by heart. So girls, that's the end of the section on percentages. There will be another video on fractions for you to do as well. Okay? Thank you.